Talking today to Sarah Murray, who is a contributor to the Financial Times and a specialist writer on corporate sustainability, which is the subject we're going to talk about today. So, Sarah, some of the origins of corporate sustainability were in that now seemingly rather tired buzzword corporate social responsibility. Describe to me how we get from there to here.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, sort of 10 or 15 years ago, companies started to think about this, but it was much more in the realm of corporate philanthropy. It was that, you know, we're doing our business on the one side, but on the other side we've got to do something about, you know, to help society and give back, and but also, you know, maybe do something for the environment as well. So they were much more, it looked much more like corporate philanthropy or charity. And that's shifted quite dramatically in the last sort of I'd say 5 years. It's, you know, probably 10 years ago it started happening, but it's a very different environment today from, I would say, 10 years ago.
So we come to corporate sustainability, and sustainability is one of those words that can mean absolutely anything. Give me some examples of the types of things it's now covering.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. I mean, that word sustainability it's a very difficult one because people just don't know what you're talking about half the time unless you put it in context. But I think broadly speaking, it's really about, I describe it as the relationship between business and society and the environment. So what is your environmental footprint? You know, what resources are you using? What pollution are you creating? And on the social side, how are you impacting communities, and how you can negatively impact communities, but how you can also, through business, your actual business activities, improve lives for people. So there's a sort of, I think there's two aspects to this on both the social and the environmental side, and one is the risk management and one is the opportunity side. And I think, again, going back to the evolution of this, when companies started to move away from the corporate philanthropy side, the very first thing they embraced was risk management. You know, how are we damaging our reputation? How are we...
So it was a kind of negative definition.
It was a very negative definition. You know, are we liable for pollution clean-up? Are we going to be attacked by NGOs? All this sort of thing. And I think now there's a much greater move towards the opportunity side of it, whether that's cost savings or shoring up your supply chain for the future. But it's really, I mean, the risk management is definitely still there, but there's now two sides to the coin.
Let's move to some examples in terms of the minimising the carbon footprint. Which companies have been particularly pioneering in doing that?
Well, I think you've seen, a lot of the energy companies thinking. Duke Energy is one that I think of in particular. But what's been interesting actually as well is to watch what one doesn't think of traditionally as energy companies thinking about this. So, I mean, I remember a long time ago doing an interview with, I think it was either a bank or an insurance company, and they said, well, you know, we've been changing the light bulbs in our offices, and of course, you know, that's not really where they should be focusing. And now you find, you know, companies like HSBC are looking at, you know, how through our lending practices can we have an impact. So HSBC, for example, in Hong Kong has some loan products which reward people if they're buying energy efficient equipment, industrial equipment, whatever it is. So, you know, I think it's not just the big polluters one thinks of. You know, the financial services industry has a huge role to play here as well, but it's a one step removed.
But as you were saying, it's a move really from focusing just on energy to focusing more widely on resources and biodiversity at some level.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think there was a huge focus on carbon emissions initially, and it was a sort of easier one to focus on, because if you're saving carbon emissions, you're saving fuel and energy costs. But now there's a much broader recognition that there's going to be resource constraints in the future. Particularly water has come up much more into focus in the last few years. And I think in some ways, you know, water is now, I mean, people think of water, it's now a much more immediate threat than global warming, because it's very localised. If there's no, you know, if you're Coca-Cola, If you don't have any water, you don't have a business. So the drinks companies, Coke and Pepsi, have been very aggressively moving into water conservation, working with NGOs, WWF, organisations like that. I mean, that's one other really interesting transition over the time I've been covering this, is that, you know, organisations that used to be enemies, you know, NGOs and business, are now working very closely together because companies are not experts on resource management or at least on water conservation. So that's been another part of the evolution of this whole thing.
And with supply chains, it's been both, in a sense, looking for savings within the process in terms of carbon footprint, but also working with suppliers in a way that is much more sympathetic to paying a higher level of wages, removing child labour, those kinds of things. Which companies have, in a sense, focused on that?
Well, interestingly, I think the companies, and this goes across the board in this area, that the companies that were most were the first to be attacked, and that were most heavily attacked have been the ones that have now, you know, moved into the forefront of this. So you think of Nike is a classic example of this. And you know, Nike was at the receiving end of boycotts from labour activists. Now, in the NGO world, it's seen as an absolute leader in managing its supply chain. And even, I think very recently, there's been even an evolution within that. So a lot of the companies initially reacted by monitoring factories and saying, well, we're going to go in and we're going to check up on, you know, what the health conditions are like, what the hours are like, what this sort of thing is. And it spawned this whole auditing industry, which sort of did a certain amount, but in the end people could fudge the books, and it hasn't had the huge impact.
Game the system. Yeah.
No, exactly. And you have double bookkeeping and all these sort of practices. And what's interesting now is that Nike and a few others are starting to think, well, what is it about our own business practices that puts pressure on the supply chain at the other end? So, you know, if we're in America and we're constantly changing designs, the factory in Thailand was already set up to do stripes, and I mean, this is a very simplistic way of putting it, but you know, they were set up to do stripes. Now we've asked for dots. That means they've got to change everything round, but the deadline's the same, so that leads to excessive overtime. And so I think the leading companies on this are really starting to look at what is it in our procurement practices, in our sourcing practices, in our design practices even, that is far along the line in a factory in China having an impact on workers. That's quite an interesting development in that side of things.
You talked earlier about social licenses for mining companies. What does the term social licenses mean?
Well, social license to operate is really, and it doesn't just apply to mining companies, but it applies more closely to companies that have big social and environmental footprints, that tend to be working in developing countries. The idea is that if you just, you know, turn up in a country and you know, set up operations, if you don't really have the buy-in of the local community, you're exposed to certain threats. So particularly if you're an oil company, you know, you may be, your pipelines may be attacked by local militia, this sort of thing. So what we've seen in recent years is a lot of companies looking at this almost as alternative security, because a lot of the big extractive industries got into trouble by using, you know, local military forces to protect their operations, and came up, you know, lots of human rights abuses happened, and they got into a lot of trouble. So I think there's a sense now that if we get the buy-in of the community by, you know, perhaps looking after their health, introducing some more educational resources, hiring them, you know, all these sort of really generating economic benefit for the community, then that gives us a much more stable base for our operations. But I think it applies to any company. You know, if you're a bank on a high street in a deprived area, you've got, you know, to be there really, you've got to give a sense that not just give a sense, but actually be actively engaging with the community. And I think that's what you call the sort of social license to operate. I mean, the question is whether companies are talking about this or actually doing it, and it's hard to know sometimes whether there's more talk than action.
I was going to say, of the whole area, how central are all these concerns to core business objectives? You know, when the CEO sits down, does he simply turn to the junior person doing this, or are they central to what he or she believes in?
I think it varies tremendously from sector to sector, but it definitely has moved into the to boardroom level, where you get and the other interesting thing is that and this I sort of got an insight into this from talking to some NGOs about this, is that one of them was saying to me, well, you know, it used to be that we used to go and talk to the CSR person or the sustainability person, and now in some companies we're going and talking to the procurement manager, which is a very good sign, because that means that actually this stuff is getting through to the actual operational departments that matter. I think you do still have very big disconnects, though. It's very difficult. Companies talk a lot about integrating this throughout their entire operations. It's something that's very hard to do, and one of the areas it shows up in, interestingly, I've noticed this particularly in the States, is you'll get a company that's talking very and meaning it. I mean, and not being not trying to sort of pull the wool over our eyes or anything, but you know, talking about environmental goals, setting carbon emissions targets, that sort of thing. And then you'll find that the lobbyists are going to Washington and lobbying for a completely different thing. And it's not necessarily that there's some sort of conspiracy going on within the company. It's just that they've never brought that particular department to speak to the people who understand the sustainability side of it. And you know, there's a lot of organisational challenges to doing this, I think.
And surely it's quite complex if somebody has already, you know, kind of geographic responsibilities, horizontal responsibilities, and then you add all of these responsibilities.
It's just another thing.
Yes.
And I think that's, and then, you know, particularly at a time of difficult, you know, it's a difficult economic time, people are under tremendous pressure. There's the old chestnut, you know, how do we increase our margins? You know, you're a middle manager, and your goals are not necessarily to save the planet. They're to, you know, increase profits for that particular business unit.
Do these things, though, feed directly into increasing margins? I mean, surely some of the stuff around carbon footprint maybe doesn't involve energy savings, but some of the other stuff is less direct.
It is more tangential, but I think companies are getting better at recognising the indirect benefits of this. And I would say that one of the unexpected and the biggest ones that I anecdotally hear all the time is that companies say this helps them recruit top talent. And I remember talking to Nike many years ago when they were still, you know, evolving their policy on the labour supply chain, and they said, well, you know, it didn't. In material terms, it didn't affect our business dramatically, the boycotts. I mean, obviously, you know, to a certain extent it did. But they said where we had real problems is that we couldn't get the right people to work for the company because, you know, we had this sort of tainted image. And I think a lot of companies have recognised this. And I think it goes to... it sort of overlaps into perhaps more the CSR and corporate, you know, philanthropy side of things as well, because, you know, if you're not a company that's honest and genuinely trying to do something for the planet and for people, a lot of the new generation coming into the workforce now don't want to work for you. Now, I mean, I think that seems a strange thing to say at a time when we've got massive unemployment. But the other thing that companies always tell me is that even when you've got massive unemployment, finding the best people is still as hard as it ever was. And this stuff is really what people want to know about now when they're joining the workforce.
Sarah, thanks for talking to me today.
Thank you.